Hi, everyone, and welcome back to the Ralston College podcast. I'm Stephen Blackwood. Today, I have the pleasure of introducing Professor Paul Epstein. He's an expert in Greek drama. Many of you will know that in the 5th or so century BC, something absolutely astonishing takes place that sets in motion, in a sense, the entirety of Western civilization. That's the golden age of Athens. The words we use today are Greek words for philosophy, for poetry, for music, architecture, chemistry, biology, physics, and so on and so forth. How did this happen? What is that time period about? How was it so influential? One of the absolutely key aspects of that golden age, that astonishing cultural development, is Greek drama, the plays of Aristophanes, of Sophocles, of Aeschylus. They're both tragedies and comedies. Today we're going to get a bit of an introduction to Greek drama through Sophocles' Women of Trachis and Aristophanes' Frogs. But before the lecture, I just want to make a brief comment about how you might think about what's going on in a play, in a drama. And that is, we all know from conversation that if you have a group of friends together, interlocutors, maybe you're having a debate or a conversation over dinner, and one person is this view and one person is that view, and there's a kind of a clash that goes back and forth. And in and through that clash, you perhaps come to understand that other position you didn't fully appreciate the truth of. Or they see weaknesses in that position as you do in your own, and you go back and forth in a way that we're all familiar with. This kind of conversation in which you might say iron sharpens iron, a kind of exchange by which you come to see more clearly the things you didn't see through the clash of different positions, that reveals, you might say, a kind of underlying unity or a deeper truth that can comprehend these diverse and different positions. That exchange, which you might say is about the most fundamental thing that we do with each other as human beings, which depends on freedom of speech, so we can share our views freely, also depends on the innate or intrinsic freedom of our minds, is also the bedrock of philosophy. It's what the word dialectic means, that exchange or opposition or movement through different perspectives. And you might say that's exactly what a play is. It's a working out in a dramatic form of different positions through different characters who are in dialogue with each other and who are on journeys themselves in that very dialogue. I hope this lecture gives you some insight into Greek drama, thanks to Dr. Epstein's expertise. Thanks for listening.
I've tried to divide this difficult subject into three parts. First, a general discussion of the polytheistic world of the polis, and then an analysis of each play. And after each section, I'll call for questions, objections, and animadversions. An objection might take the form of saying, Mr. Epstein, do you really think that saying the infinite unity of this and that is an adequate way to speak about these difficult matters? I rather like polemics. So if you disagree, or why not say so? Questions, statements, or protests on that? Or can we take that as read, that we'll have this threefold discussion? It is a great pleasure to discuss with you this afternoon two monuments of the great Athenian flourishing of the 5th century: The Women of Trachis, a tragedy by Sophocles, and Frogs, a comedy by Aristophanes. Both are moments in the Athenians' attempt to discover the inner meaning of their polis-centered polytheistic culture. The reason I'm using this perhaps exaggerated language, polis-centered polytheistic culture, is that I think it's absolutely essential for a rational understanding of drama, both ancient and Shakespearean, to realize that the side of the divine cannot be left out any more than the side of the organization of the political order can be left out of account. Oftentimes, as I'll discuss more later, people regard talking about the gods as a kind of epiphenomenon, as the Marxists say, which I think is utterly inadequate. Let's look at it this way. If you ask, what makes the United States the United States? Is it possible to have the United States without initially a Calvinist culture and then the modification of that Calvinist culture by Enlightenment? A learned professor of law at Yale said the United States is a shotgun marriage between Calvinism and Enlightenment. And when I said this to a philosophical friend of mine, sort of scoffing at him, she said, "Oh no, he's thinking and he doesn't know how to hold those two sides together." And both of them are right, I think. If someone could unite the Calvinist background of the United States with its Enlightenment background in a rational whole, that person would be accomplishing much. I suppose you could say it was already accomplished by Lincoln at his second inaugural, when he said that although slavery was one of those evils which under the divine providence necessarily came, if the abolition of slavery demanded or called for the entire destruction of the United States, then would we say, Lincoln said, as the psalmist said 3,000 years ago, the judgments of God are altogether righteous. In discussing Greek tragedy, what the gods are is absolutely essential to making sense of what the drama is. And of course, as you all know from your study of the Odyssey, what the gods are in Greek religion is not easily said. It's radically different from our own forms, although I suppose what makes the United States is really a polytheist country in its own ways, just rather boringly so. And there's no reconciliation of the different gods. If you say a different god presides over a different sphere of human activity, I must confess to two forms of personal polytheism: the worship of the lawn and the worship of the tooth. I asked the same philosophical friend whom I had alluded to earlier, which of these two forms of American polytheism she thought was more popular. She said, those who aren't too well off worship the lawn more, and those who are better off worship the tooth. If you asked me rationally, I couldn't care less about the lawn, but my bourgeois side is always worried about what the neighbors are going to think. And I recently had experience of the advantage or the rights of this polytheism. The man in charge of the lawn service that looks after my lawn, they do, I don't understand a word of it. All I understand is how to write the checks and occasionally turn on water as part of my worship of the great god lawn. But when the person who ran the service came and cast, does one say a side eye, is that what one said? At the neighbor's lawn, and they pride themselves on being members of the haute bourgeoisie. When I saw, and he said, oh, that's a very shabby lawn. I realized what I was paying for and what I was gaining by being a member of this rather disreputable polytheistic sect. You know, if you ask about other aspects of polytheism in the United States, I think we have to acknowledge that phallus worship is now clearly. Does any of you watch television? Have you seen what passes for an advertisement on American television nowadays in terms of phallus worship? There's actually a company, called the Bent Carrot. I'm not inventing this. And not only do we have these various forms of these many gods, nobody asks what is the order of these gods, which are more important, which have to be subordinated to others. We just have this miscellaneous polytheism. I suppose in a town like Savannah, your food worship is very big in Savannah. I can tell just by wandering around. I've been struck for many years that the food columns and the sex columns seem to be about the same. The word luscious appears all the time. But the Greeks were capable of confronting their polytheism, asking which of these gods is really worthy of worship, or how can I give place to a number of these gods. Think of the gods as presiding over the family, the state, and as we're going to see, over dramatic poetry itself, which was presided over by the god Dionysus. So dealing with this polytheism is the first and gravest difficulty in making sense of these poems. The second is the difference between the Greek world out of which drama arose and, let's say, the early modern world out of which the Shakespearean drama arose. When Greek drama arose, there was not yet either a doctrinal religion nor a clear philosophy. When Shakespeare wrote, end of the 16th, beginning of the 17th century, there were not only the established forms of the Roman Church in the Middle Ages, there was the new Reformation and a continuing Neoplatonic culture. Anybody who looks at Shakespeare's sonnets, for example, knows that either he's read the Symposium himself, or he's read The Intelligent Poet's Guide to the Symposium. I think it was George Bernard Shaw who wrote something called The Intelligent Woman's Guide to Socialism. And it's a useful shorthand for books in which people who don't really want to do the hard labor of research can find out all the principles. Maybe there's an intelligent person's guide to the Bible in which an account is given of some of the main principles. But the Greek world, there is no organized doctrine. There was no catechism class, for example, in which you were told there are 12 Olympian gods. I don't know who invented the idea that there are 12 Olympian gods. Perhaps every school boy and girl is told that now. But it's not like the Ten Commandments. It wasn't a doctrinal religion. And, as I'll discuss later very briefly, philosophy had not yet arisen at the time of the flourishing. Well, it had barely arisen at the time of the flourishing of dramatic poetry. Whereas when Shakespeare and the great playwrights of France and Spain in the 17th century, when they wrote, it was against the background of established doctrinal religions. That is, whether you most favor the Roman Catholic form or a Protestant form, both have clear doctrines and clear organized practices. None of that existed when Greek tragedy and comedy arose. So what these great poets did is revolutionary in the world historical sense, never to be repeated. A religion that has authority for them becomes a matter to be questioned. I'm happy to say that neither Aeschylus nor Euripides nor Sophocles nor Aristophanes was ever put in jail for heresy. Even though, for example, in the Birds of Aristophanes, Zeus loses control. I hope I'm not being recorded, but this is the trouble that could result. Zeus is no longer in control. In Lysistrata, even, and the poet can't say this so directly, even Athena is no longer at the center after the analysis of that drama. When I said to my PhD advisor, Birds won only second prize, he looked at me as if I were insane and said, if it's teaching that Zeus is no longer in charge, you can see why people might not think it's worthy of first prize. It says something for their wonderful liberalism in the reasonable sense that he wasn't arrested. This clarification of their received traditional culture, that is, of the polytheistic culture, has both a poetical and a philosophical side. The poetical side had its flowering first, although there is also some overlap between the two. I think some people had arisen by 450, and we know from Clouds, where Socrates is treated not quite rightly as a sophist, that kind of thinking was already present. The poetical flowering had its deepest expression in the tragedies of Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides, and in the comedies of Aristophanes. The philosophical side, of course, had its flowering in Plato and Aristotle. And as you all know from your current reading, it's no accident that a dialogue like Symposium concludes with Socrates. Are spoilers allowed? Symposium concludes with Socrates trying to persuade both Agathon and Aristophanes that the same person should be able to write both comedy and tragedy. So it is not we who have invented this idea that comedy and tragedy and philosophy are the deepest expressions of the Hellenic religious and philosophical spirit. I think we also have to say here, before there is a clear philosophical sense of these matters, people would not have asked themselves when they got back from a dramatic presentation, was that religion or was that art? I don't think such a division had occurred to people yet. Whereas when Shakespeare was writing, I think there was already a more clearly established relation and differentiation amongst religion, the artistic realm, and the philosophical realm. Although there are overlaps, of course. Any churchgoer, some churchgoers would be in a state of ecstasy if they had a philosophical clergyman, as Mr. Ralston was, as you perhaps heard. Very thoughtful man. I'm going to say something more about him in a minute. Before I enter into any further discussion of this remarkable 5th century, I would like to indicate a point of coincidence between the analysis that I shall attempt and the thinking of the man after whom this college is named, William Ralston. 20-odd years ago, I heard Mr. Ralston preach an especially thoughtful sermon on the Feast of All Saints, which is, 7 days from today, at All Souls Church, Oklahoma City. He interpreted that feast as meaning that God would eventually bring all men and women to salvation. As a true Christian preacher, he did not simply repeat the details of the scriptural readings appointed by the prayer book for the day, nor how the feast had been regarded in the history of the church. Rather, he applied his theological and philosophical capacities, and they were rather great, I may say, to interpreting the mixture of thought and image that define the scriptures. Obviously, there are great differences between the scriptures and Greek dramas that we shall treat of today. But the interpreter of Greek drama has a task analogous to that of the thoughtful preacher, to discover in the bold and sometimes disturbing images of the ancient dramatists the argument and spirit that has animated them and their consideration of the divine-human relationship. If Greek drama is not primarily or essentially about the divine-human relation, I say read the Bhagavad Gita instead, or some, not to waste one's time on Greek drama. The world in which, I don't mean anything against the Bhagavad Gita, it's a splendid work. The world in which women of Trachis and frogs were written was that which followed the great victory of the Greek city-states over the Persians in 480 BC. You're, of course, already familiar with the Greeks coming together, fighting the Trojan War, and Odysseus is returning from that unification of the Greek world. Some further dates would be useful here. I think this is necessary pedantry, but at first the dates of poets and philosophers. Aeschylus was born in 526 and died in 456. Sophocles was born in 496 and died in 406, while Euripides was born in 480 and died in 406. The dates of Aristophanes are less clear, but a birth date of 444 and a death date of 388 are likely. As you all know, these dates before and after Christ, I think, only became regularized in the 6th century of our era. Plato was born in 428 and died in 348. Thus, the symposium is set at about 416, isn't it? That's when Agathon won a tragic victory. So Plato would have been 12. So not probably present. Aristotle was born in 384 and died in 321. Second, some political dates. The Peloponnesian War was waged between 431 and 404 and effectively marked the end of Athenian hegemony in the Hellenic world. Alexander the Great lived from 356 to 323, and his conquests marked the beginning of what we later came to call the Hellenistic world. Both women of Trachis and frogs were written before Athenian hegemony. The hegemony had its manifest decline. It's impossible to give a precise date to women of Trachis. Estimates range from 450 to 425. Frogs, of course, assumes the death of Euripides and thus can be dated to about 406. Both comedy and tragedy were presented within a festival of the god Dionysus, who was one of many gods worshipped at Athens. Each god presided over a different aspect of life in the polis, whether that aspect belonged to the whole community or the family, and had a cultus peculiar to him or herself. There were women-only cults, which in the play Thesmophoriatsousi, Euripides invaded and thought nothing of doing it. There's considerable debate over whether women were allowed at the tragedies, and I think they're rather inconclusive. It's only at the end of this period that the Athenians begin to think that there is a radical equality between the sexes, radical at root. For example, I'm beginning to think more and more that the reason that Socrates says that the true teaching about eros will come from a learned woman is to show that mind is beyond the difference between the sexes, that mind belongs equally to male and female. At a certain point in Lysistrata, when she's trying to persuade the men to listen to her, she said, "I am a woman and there is nous in me." That must be a great revolution in human thought. One likes to imagine that in spirit, that St. Paul, who said famously, "In Christ there is neither male nor female, Jew nor Greek," that in spirit he and Aristophanes had a consult about finding in the realm of the spirit that which belongs to both sexes. Not a denial of the differences, but finding that which is ultimately similar. The city, of course, of Athens was named after Athena, and her magnificent temple, the Parthenon, was completed about 430. As I said earlier, there was no set creed or defined holy book, and even the charge against Socrates, as we know it from Apology, was that he did not acknowledge the gods that the city acknowledges. Compare this situation, no set creed, but a variety of rituals, to that which used to prevail among Western Christians, whether Roman Catholic, Lutheran, or Calvinist. To oversimplify somewhat, each of these had three main elements. The Bible, even if there was a dispute about certain books. As you know, the Roman Catholics regard as canonical certain books that the Protestants at best call apocryphal. But the idea that the Bible is at the center, or, well, an absolutely essential element is common to all three forms of Western Christianity. A creedal statement, which would include the Nicene Creed or something similar. Unless I don't think any of the churches, well, maybe some have decided to leave it out, but it used to be regarded as essential that people actually state what they believe during the most important service of the Sunday. Well, it's rather remarkable, isn't it, that, after hearing, who knows, appeals for more money or signing pledge cards, all of a sudden one starts talking Trinitarian language. But that used to be essential to people's sense of being a Christian. And then finally, a form of Holy Communion, which summed up for the believer the totality of his relation to God. I think if you want to see the difference amongst the main Western forms of Christianity, look at their older communion services. They're all about how the believer understands himself or herself as a redeemed sinner. When I say him or herself, this is very interesting that I don't think no matter how conservative a church there is or was, no one has ever said there should be two Holy Communion services. Male on Sunday morning, female on Sunday afternoon. Just not possible. The service belonged to believers qua believers. These three forms gave a definiteness to Western Christianity. Although, who knows what Western Christians nowadays believe. And I suppose much worship consists of rolling around on the floor and announcing how much one loves Jesus, or something like that. But that wasn't the Greek world. One day there were cults of the household. For example, I don't know if you would have read about the so-called mutilation of the Herms. There were, how shall I put this, so that pearl clutch, well, I'm not accusing any of you all of being pearl clutchers. There were statues, with erect phalluses on every household to encourage, I suppose it was part of a fertility cult. And on the eve of the Syracusan expedition, which proved to be a catastrophe, some free spirits went around knocking off the phalluses of the statues. So there was that. There was the drama. There were cults of every sort, cults of Athena. I don't think one had to pay attention. One just sort of turned up. An aspect of Athenian and Hellenic polytheism that sharply differentiates it both from Jewish and Christian religion is that the gods themselves have a history. You'll have met this in reading the Odyssey. There are Titanic gods. There are Olympian gods. And guess which was first? The Titanic, and then gave way to the Olympian. The reigning Olympian gods arrived at their current supremacy only after a war with the Titanic powers. One can see this in Hesiod, but this divine history would not, of course, have been taught in some Athenian catechism class. Well, Billy, please tell the class, when did Zeus overthrow the Titanic powers? Do you think there should be candy canes? Well, I don't know. Are candy canes given for right answers in catechism class? For example, even though there was no catechism, but let's say the equivalent of catechism would have been statues and the Parthenon. For example, the decorations on the Parthenon would have included aspects of this divine history, such as the war with the giants, or Theseus's war with the centaurs, or on the pediment, Athena being born out of the head of Zeus, implying, and again, I hope there are no spies, that in some way Athena was more rational than her father. So you wouldn't want to call that a catechism, but it's part of their self-understanding. Again, if we don't realize that Greek religion has a radically different beginning than Jewish and Christian religion, namely with sensuous powers that eventually give way to the more rational and Olympian powers. You'll have seen this in the experience of Odysseus. Remember when he was a boy toy to Calypso for 7 years, every 18-year-old male's dream, endless sex with Calypso. He found it tedious. Why? He had a wife and a polis and children. It took him a while to realize that he didn't enjoy being a boy toy. The poet has included that to show us that this is something that Odysseus learned, just as the gods themselves learn that the true deities are the Olympian deities. That the gods have a history in which the Titanic powers come before the Olympian is reflected in the Hellenic understanding of human beings, in which the natural, the pre-rational, the sensuous have a kind of recognized independence that they could not have in a culture of Christian origin. I mentioned the fertility gods. Nobody went home, horrified and pearl clutching when they saw these Herms. It is not yet assumed that each human being should have an ordered relation of his passionate and rational sides within himself. That Odysseus had sexual relations with both Circe and Calypso would not have branded him as an adulterer worthy of opprobrium. It is an inescapable part of his wandering. He's looking for who he is. In this world where people are in a certain way first coming to self-consciousness as opposed to a customary relation, they have to try out all sorts of things because they don't know yet which is most important. In the realm of knowledge, it is assumed that all manner of information is best gained from consulting oracles. I must confess, I hope the Hellenic Society doesn't have me arrested, that I grow weary of all these oracles and drama sometimes. But I better follow my own advice. If it's part of their journey to understanding, well, maybe is it any worse than the kind of people who say, well, do you have Dillard's here in Savannah? The Dillard's department store, or is that a Midwestern phenomenon? Let's make it Macy's. You've probably heard people who say, or at least in Oklahoma they talk this way sometimes, well, I couldn't find a parking place at Macy's, but then I prayed for 5 minutes, and all of a sudden a parking place opened up for me. I think I'll take oracles any day of the week. At least the oracle, you had to think about what the oracle meant. It wasn't just an answer of... So consulting oracles is not proof of idiocy or superstition, but an aspect of the human condition. Oedipus receives a number of oracular. Do you think we regard economists nowadays as oracles? I sometimes think they should be required to wear, what do you call the, priests used to wear them. A mitre, yeah, those kinds of mitres. And, oh, great economist, is inflation going up, down, or around? And maybe the economy is the worst of, the worship of the economy is the worst of the polytheistic aspects of our religion. We're told the gross national product went up. And we're all meant to say the equivalent of Hosanna to the Son of David, every time we hear this. Whether we're any happier with an increased gross national product, I have, a friend of mine said, who was born in 1937, she said, she thought medical care had improved since 1937. But other than that, not much. Think how much better the middle classes used to live. Now, of course, for white people, this was somewhat dependent on, there being a black underclass to do the work, at very low wages. But respectable middle-class ladies would never have visited grocery stores. You call the grocer and he delivers something. When I moved to Oklahoma, I was initially in a state of shock when I discovered quite prosperous people did not have cleaning ladies. It used to be that was part of middle-class respectability. Once one rises into at least on the East Coast generally, once one is in the middle classes, one hires. My mother once said quite naively to me, Paul, no matter how poor your father and I were, we always had someone in to clean. But maybe that world doesn't exist anymore. Although both women of Trachis and frogs arise within the polytheistic culture of the 5th century polis, they set the stage of the world of the gods and the polis in radically different ways. The difference between tragedy and comedy is much sharper Hellenically than it is in Shakespeare. The Women of Trachis is set in what we might call the mythological past, but which is really the dawn of civilization as the Greeks understood it. The Olympian powers have only recently triumphed over the Titanic powers, and their rule has only recently been secured, as is shown by the competition between the river god and Heracles for the hand of Deianira. Must be wrong. I mean, having a river god for a suitor cannot have been couldn't have been high status, I don't think. While nothing in the drama per se announces that it is a drama, as would happen in a comedy, Women of Trachis would nevertheless have held a mirror before the spectators. The contest between the Titans and the Olympians was not merely or even especially ancient history, but an aspect of their self-understanding, as the decorations of the Parthenon show. Heracles was part of a common Hellenic past, and the temple of Zeus at Olympia where Pan-Hellenic games were held included a statue of the god Man. Did you all visit Olympia? It's quite remarkable, of course. And when you see the statue in the museum, you realize, I don't think the modern so-called Olympics are really quite up to it. The last line of the drama of Women of Trachis, "And nothing here is not Zeus," would have spoken directly to a people who devoted themselves to the worship of his daughter. So I don't think we should regard any of these tragedies as mythological history. They're in mythological form, but that's possible because the dramas deal with types and are not trying to communicate empirical history. We tend to assume that true art, in a way, is what I call the New York Times view of art. That is, if there had been a reporter there, would he have reported such and such? Can you imagine the New York Times report of the fall of man in the Bible? We could not independently confirm what the exact status of the snake was, etc. The 19th century, whether in terms of the newspaper world or photographs, has, I think, given us a wrong view of art. We think of art often as presenting the quotidian to us in its immediacy, which is what photographs do. I don't think any of the older artists would have so regarded what they did. That art had to be typical. Think of something that we regard as so lifelike as Jane Austen. Unless each Jane Austen novel is about a certain question of the relation between the sexes in marriage, I don't think it would ever have captured the imagination. You'll notice, for example, I don't think we know what color hair most of her characters have. We're told some of them are handsome, some of them are tall, some of them are this. But what she's interested in is the relation, to quote the title, what is the relation of sense and sensibility in men and women who are going to get to marry? Typical questions. And the Hellenic drama, of course, is radically typical. Nobody would come home from the Women of Trachis and say, well, I read in the New York Times that, or I guess it's the Athens Times, I read that Heracles never tried to introduce another woman into the household. The connection, however, of frogs to the spectators would have been far more direct. The opening lines of the play show the slave of Dionysus asking him what he should say to make the spectators laugh. The occasion of the dramatic action is the recent death of Euripides, 406. Nevertheless, since the main character is a god-man, the dramatic action is not merely in the present, but draws contemporary events into a relation with an eternal god. Any play that has people going down to Hades is not looking for a New York Times account of history. The difference between a tragedy and comedy lies not in the formal elements, that is, human subjects, gods, and the communities of the polis culture. These, I think, are the three essentials to Greek drama. Rather, it lies in how they are brought together, either from the communities of the polis and the gods who preside over them, or from the side of the human subject who is seeking to integrate these elements. When I say is seeking, I'm not saying that Dionysus at the beginning of The Frogs has a conference with, I don't know, his Freudian analyst and said, I think I better try to unify gods and men. It happens. And only when it's over does he know that that's what he's doing. In Women of Trachis, the emphasis is on Zeus as the one who underlies the stability of the family as a spiritual community. That's the last line of the play. And know that nothing you have seen here is not Zeus. In Frogs, it is the god-man Dionysus, who in his humanity searches for the unity of the polis and its celebratory knowledge, which is what they discover tragedy is. As we begin our closer examination of these two dramas, let me indicate what I regard as two necessary principles of interpretation. The first is that there is an underlying argument in a Hellenic drama, and that all its parts advance that argument. Sometimes it's hard to discover, but some critics, whom I won't name to protect the guilty, announce from time to time, say in a comedy, oh, this is just parody, and then there's some satire, and then they go home. I don't think that happens in a great drama. Everything contributes to the essential action of the drama. And if we can't find it, we just have to think more. A friend of mine in Nova Scotia once said that when I read a Greek drama, I'm always asking myself the question, why does line 4 come after line 5? But put it in its proper order, and I think it's a reasonable way to proceed. The second principle of interpretation is that the avoidance of anachronism is necessary in discovering that argument. Various well-meaning people have approached Greek dramas with ideas, for example, drawn from Marx, Freud, or modern existentialism. A university teacher of English and literature has told me that the first matter he must clarify in teaching Oedipus the King is that Oedipus does not have an Oedipus complex. I think the response, both an academic and a lady from the Bronx here, are very suitable. Emil Fackenheim, who was both a rabbi and a philosopher, and you'll excuse my imitating his German accent, but I think it's part of the, he said, the question here in Freud's treatment of Oedipus is he talking about humanity, or is he talking about late Victorian, upper middle class Jewish humanity? And I think Dr. Fackenheim is absolutely right. The second remark is right in its own way. A lady in the Bronx, and this was when the United States worshipped at the feet of Dr. Freud more than it does now, thank goodness. She felt she had to send her son to see a psychiatrist because he was too attached to his mother. And she was, Mrs. Goldberg reported this to her friend, Mrs. Freed, and said, well, they tell me he has an Oedipus complex. To which her friend replies, Oedipus schmedipus, a boy shouldn't like his mother? But these fantasies, these Freudian fantasies, do they still exist? Or have they been replaced by other fantasies of interpretation? People used to find Marxian interpretations. Marx himself said that Prometheus should be on the calendar of every proletarian. To say that the play Prometheus Bound, which is set at the dawn of history, is really about class conflict, I think it rather obscures a number of questions. People always discover existentialists in the Greeks. Name a Greek drama, and somebody will say that it's really about existential man. For example, I'm not saying this is existentialism. I don't think that one can accurately talk about the self or the search for the self in Greek drama. I don't think there is yet such a sense of a self separate from its relation to the polis order and from the gods. I think there is a movement towards what I'm going to call the individual an individual in the strict sense who is both a particular and a type. So I think we have to be very careful about finding a self. Can I call it I was going to call it a selfless world. That sounds very, in a pre-self world. One very happy moment of teaching I had was, it was a general literature class, and I said, the ancient Jews were far more convinced of the existence of God than they were of the existence of themselves. And a young man thought for a bit and said, "You mean 180 degrees different from our current world?" I thought, this young man is learning something. He can see that. And this is perhaps the most difficult task of interpretation, to try to put aside our contemporary views and see what the Greeks are thinking. I know that I'm always catching myself. When I finally come, to understand something in Greek drama, I also have a moment of realization about what false assumption I was making based on anachronism. The man who supervised my PhD thesis on the birds of Aristophanes has written that Aristophanes to many moderns seems a curious mixture of pornography and censorious conservatism. I think he's right. All of us begin by assuming the ideas that are in the air, as it were. And at each stage, we must be asking whether we are bringing appropriate categories to bear in our interpretation of ancient drama. Always an occasion for much polemics, because one person will accuse the other of historicism, another person will accuse the other of existentialism. But it's very easy to fall into these. Let me give an example of anachronism at the linguistic level that is inimical to a true understanding of Aristophanes. The poet will use the verb benein. I'll give the infinitive form. It's an epsilon contract. And there's an example in Frogs when the slave of Dionysus, the slave says that the god only knows how to do those two things. Both are infinitives, of course. The first infinitive means to drink, but how does one translate the second? Liddell Scott is no help. It announces the verb is obscene and offers a translation into Latin. When I began my Aristophanes studies, I was bemused by this and decided to ask an Englishman who taught Greek philosophy, where I was a PhD student, what was going on. I also knew that, like many English academics, and maybe like academics in general, he sort of enjoyed mischief as long as it could be passed off as scholarship. As you can see, and you'll see that I'm probably subject to the same description. With no small pleasure, he announced, you'll excuse my imitating an English accent, just to get the combination of sneering and sophistication, to try to get it right. This word can be properly translated only by our English word fuck. At the time, I thought that he was right. But reflection has convinced me that there is more to the story. The problem lies in using the category of obscenity in relation to a Greek verb. Our notions about this are mostly drawn from the Victorians. In Aristophanes, the verb is simply frank, and it can be used to describe a male sexual penetration of either a female or another male. The frankness is possible owing to the peculiar role that the sensuous has in the Greek culture of the time. The English language has no similar word of sexual frankness without moral judgment, because such an idea could not exist in the Christian culture in which the English language developed. In such a culture, the Christian culture, the sensuous, unless it is an aspect of rational activity, is regarded as excessive. To describe a character as engaging in a sensuous activity without further comment or implication would be scandalous. In Aristophanes, describing a character's sexual proclivities is to show a moment in his search for the particular form that his individuality takes. Aristophanes is not trying to épater les bourgeois. You have to have a bourgeoisie before you can try to épater them. That is, in Victorian culture, where all sorts of things were forbidden, to utter forbidden words there's a delight in being shocking. Aristophanes has no such delight because there's no need for such delight. If Aristophanes wants to have his slave describe Dionysus in a certain way, it's for a reason that is true. That is, that the god Dionysus has to be educated. And, for example, when Dionysus asks Heracles to tell him about how to get to Hades, he said, among other things, where are the best restaurants? Where are the best brothels? That's the state of soul that the god Dionysus is in. And it's no use our having Victorian fits that even the god Dionysus is not complete yet. I really think that one of the difficulties is this. The Victorians, and I think we've inherited this, seem to assume that a drama consists of people standing around in a drawing room uttering marvelous speeches about how to, what's good. Whereas anybody who's serious about drama knows, let's say in light of Symposium, that drama presents love's confusions and love's clarifications. You can't know what the clarifications of Eros are unless you know what the confusions are. You've seen it in Pausanias' speech, the earlier speeches. They're confused about the nature of Eros. I think every great drama has characters who are confused. It's not just sexual excess. There's an excess of desire for revenge. Think of Hamlet, who's going to be unhappy that Claudius can be saved. Far creepier, to my way of thinking, than the occasional benign or so thrown in from time to time. Because Hellenic culture begins from this sensuous side of the gods, there's no pretending that it doesn't. It's not mentioned to be shocking, it's not mentioned to be rejoiced in, but it is simply the condition of the characters. And I think to pretend otherwise makes the study of literature impossible. Let me give an extreme example. As late as the 1960s, an edition of the poems of Catullus came out in which the editor said, some poems, about a quarter of Catullus's poems, have been left out because they're not suitable for comment in English. Anybody who is a serious student of Catullus knows that there is in Catullus, in his love poetry, a combination of true gentleness, real love, and sexual violence. If you want to know who Catullus is, you have to see him as he is and not hope that he's all of a sudden going to turn into a Victorian neo-Kantian gentleman. I wonder, if you're a neo-Kantian, well, if you think that the sensuous is simply something to be avoided, you can't have drama. It just can't exist. Would you pay 50 cents to go to a drama in which people gave noble speeches and nothing much happened? Think of what, again, looking at the older Christianity. Every Holy Communion service, people used to confess, not in colorful language, but to a series of, provoking most justly thy wrath and indignation against us, says the old prayer book. I guess used right over here still. They didn't say, oh, please, God, I've made a few mistakes. Please overlook it. In literature, as in Christian religion, if you're going to have literature, you have to acknowledge what people are like. And Well, there's no pretending that sexual excess is simply part of the human condition. Maybe there are a few brave souls like Teresa of Avila who weren't attacked by it. Certainly the god Dionysus seems to... Although we moderns can easily fall into anachronism in our interpretation of ancient drama, it must nevertheless be said that the period after 1700 or so is the time after the beginning of the Hellenistic period when it is possible to give an accurate account of Greek drama. We're very lucky that we can actually free ourselves, if we work at it, from bad assumptions and make sense of it. Neither the Romans nor the medievals nor the early moderns of the 17th century were capable of grasping the essential elements of the polis culture. I remember looking up many years ago what Augustine in The City of God had to say about Aristophanes. And he quoted some ancient Roman who said, "Oh, it's a mockery of the gods." Well, I had a fit and I was raving. And my PhD professor said, he didn't quiet my raving. He just tried to give it a rational form. He said, "Yes," he said, "it would be many a year before there was sufficient subjective freedom to make sense of Aristophanes." And I think that's what we should say. First, no one could properly distinguish the Roman world from the Greek until the 18th century. We find that hard to believe, but I think it's true. It was assumed that the Roman was in continuity with the Hellenic world and that in some way it completed it. For example, people thought the Roman gods were essentially the same as the Greek. In the Acts of the Apostles, for example, it is reported that Paul got into trouble by interfering with the cult of Artemis of the Ephesians. They were losing money. The Vulgate, which St. Jerome did mostly, calls her Diana of the Ephesians, not Artemis, as if there were no difference. This error is repeated in the King James translation and in Luther's. I think it was the 19th century or our century before the translation of the Bible was finally accurate. There is simply no consciousness of a profound difference between Greek and Roman religion. That is, I think, at the root of the trouble. You all weren't in Italy, so you didn't see all the various Titian Venuses in which Venus becomes a symbol of universal beauty. Name 3 Greek tragedies in which Aphrodite is a symbol of universal beauty. It doesn't exist. But it just didn't bother them. That Jupiter and Zeus are identical is an error that has been foisted on generations of American school children. What is one taught at school? Aphrodite is the goddess of love. What this assumes is that love already existed in their consciousness, and then they dreamed up a goddess to preside over it. That's just not how religion works. Another confusion that has subsisted into our own time is the positing of something called Greco-Roman architecture. I thought of this before I looked around Savannah, which is very charming, but it also falls subject to my strictures, I'm afraid. See if I'm being fair. I can walk 50 feet from my house in Guthrie, Oklahoma, and see an enormous Scottish Rite temple in the Greco-Roman style, including columns that support nothing. In Rome at the Piazza Venezia is the Victor Emmanuel Memorial in that style, called the Typewriter by locals. I mean, it's quite monstrous. Against these tendencies, there arose in the 18th century an admiration for the Hellenic per se. I think that's the first beginning that people could separate the Hellenic from the Roman. Winckelmann in Germany first distinguished between Hellenic and Hellenistic statues. Hegel clearly distinguished Greek religion and Roman religion, finding more affinity between Greek and Jewish religion than between either and Roman religion. He called both Jewish and Greek religion the religions of spiritual individuality. Perhaps this interest in the Hellenic world arose from the new form that political order took in the late 17th and 18th centuries. That is, the political system was thought to derive from individuals who had rights and also enjoyed their place in a private sphere in some sense independent of the political order. This seems to have induced a feeling of atomization, out of which arose an attraction for the more organic world of the polis, in which no private sphere yet existed. In this country, it's post-World War II that enthusiasm for Greek drama arose. Translations, tremendous enthusiasm. Maybe people felt the atomizing tendencies of the consumer society. The desire for a more unified world than the one that we have can simultaneously attract one to the study of the polis and also bias our examination of it by emphasizing only the organic structure of the polis community. That's what attracted me. I thought, oh, a world in which society and the state are absolutely identical. This is a world I'd much prefer to live in than a world of capitalistic, of endless consumerism. The search for a balance between the organic structure of the polis and the individual is not only a necessity of scholarly investigation, but belongs to the drama of the 5th century itself. Tragedy emphasizes the structures of the community, while comedy starts with the individual's exploration of that structure. Tragedy appeared first in Athenian history, just as the customary order of polis life preceded the examination of it.